Right, day 4, 100 days project. Any minute now, I'm gonna start losing track of the of what number we're on, and that's cool too. So this will be the continuation, and probably not the end of, but we'll do what we can in about uh, 20 minutes. This will be what, part 3, I guess, of Arthur C. Clarke's rescue party, picking up where we left off. There was a small crowd waiting for them. That was to be expected, but Oristron could see at once that something more than curiosity had brought his friends here. Even before a word was spoken, he knew that something was wrong. Torquely hasn't returned. He's lost his party, and we're going in to the rescue. Come along to the control room at once. From the beginning, Torquely had been luckier than Oristron. He had followed the zone of twilight, keeping away from the intolerable glare of the sun, until he came to the shores of an inland sea. It was a very recent sea, one of the latest of man's works, for the land it covered had been desert less than a century before. In a few hours it would be desert again, for the water was boiling, and clouds of steam were rising to the skies. But they could not veil the loveliness of the great white city that overlooked the tideless sea. Flying machines were still parked neatly round the square in which Torquely landed. They were disappointingly primitive, though beautifully finished, and depended on rotating airfoils for support. Nowhere was there any sign of life, but the place gave the impression that its inhabitants were not very far away. Lights were still shining from some of the windows. Torquely's 3 companions lost no time in leaving the machine. Leader of the party, by seniority of rank and race, was Zinadri, who, like Alvaron himself, had been born on one of the ancient planets of the central suns. Next came Alarcane, from a race which was one of the youngest in the universe, and took a perverse pride in that fact. Last came one of the strange beings from the system of Palador. It was nameless, like all its kind, for it possessed no identity of its own, being merely a mobile but still dependent cell in the consciousness of its race. Though it and its fellows had long been scattered over the galaxy in the exploration of countless worlds, some unknown link still bound them together as inexorably as the living cells in a human body. When a creature of Palador spoke, the pronoun it used was always we. There was not, nor could there ever be, any first person singular in the language of Palador. The great doors of the splendid building baffled the explorers, though any human child could have known their secret. Synodry wasted no time on them, but called Torquely on his personal transmitter. Then the 3 hurried aside while their commander maneuvered his machine into the best position. There was a brief burst of intolerable flame. The mass of steelwork flickered once at the edge of the visible spectrum and was gone. The stones were still glowing when the eager party hurried into the building, the beams of their light projectors fanning before them. The torches were not needed. Before them lay a great hall, glowing with light from lines of tubes along the ceiling. On either side, the hall opened out into long corridors, while straight ahead a massive stairway swept majestically toward the upper floors. For a moment, Zenodri hesitated. Then, since one way was as good as another, he led his companions down the first corridor. The feeling that life was near had now become very strong. At any moment, it seemed, they might be confronted by the creatures of this world. If they showed hostility, and they could scarcely be blamed if they did, the paralyzers would be used at once. The tension was very great as the party entered the first room, and only relaxed when they saw that it held nothing but machines, row after row, held nothing but machines, row after row of them, now stilled and silent. Lining the enormous room were thousands of metal filing cabinets, forming a continuous wall as far as the eye could reach. And that was all. There was no furniture, nothing but the cabinets and the mysterious machines. Alarcane, always the quickest of the three, was already examining the cabinets. Each held many thousand sheets of tough, thin material, perforated with innumerable holes and slots. The Paladorian appropriated one of the cards, and Alarcane recorded the scene together with some close-ups of the machines. Then they left. The great room, which had been one of the marvels of the world, meant nothing to them. No living eye would ever again see that wonderful battery of almost human holograph analyzers and the 5,000 million punched cards holding all that could be recorded on each man, woman, and child on the planet. It was clear that this building had been used very recently. With growing excitement, the explorers hurried on to the next room. This they found to be an enormous library, for millions of books lay all around them on miles and miles of shelving. Here, though the explorers could not know it, were the records of all the laws that man had ever passed, and all the speeches that had ever been made in his council chambers. Synodry was deciding his plan of action when Alarcane drew his attention to one of the racks 100 yards away. It was half empty, unlike all the others. Around it, books lay in a tumbled heap on the floor, as if knocked down by someone in frantic haste. The signs were unmistakable. Not long ago, other creatures had been this way. Faint wheel marks were clearly visible on the floor to the acute sense of Alarcon, uh, though the others could see nothing. Alarcane could even detect footprints, but knowing nothing of the creatures that had formed them, he could not say which way they led. The sense of nearness was stronger than ever now, but it was nearness in time, not in space. Alarcane voiced the thoughts of the party. Those books must have been valuable, and someone has come to rescue them, rather as an afterthought, I should say. That, se- that means there must be a place of refuge, possibly not very far away. Perhaps we may be able to find some other clues that will lead us to it. Synodry agreed. The Paladorian wasn't enthusiastic. That may be so, it said, but the refuge may be anywhere on the planet, and we have just 2 hours left. Let us waste no more time if we hope to rescue these people. The party hurried forward once more, pausing only to collect a few books that might be useful to the scientists at base, though it was doubtful if they could ever be translated. They soon found that the great building was composed largely of small rooms, all showing signs of recent occupation. Most of them were in a neat and tidy condition, but one or two were very much the reverse. The explorers were particularly puzzled by one room, clearly an office of some kind, that appeared to have been completely wrecked. The floor was littered with papers, the furniture had been smashed, and smoke was pouring through the broken windows from the fires outside. Synodry was rather alarmed. Surely no dangerous animal could have got into a place like this, he exclaimed, fingering his paralyzer nervously. Alarcane did not answer. He began to make that annoying sound which his race called laughter. It was several minutes before he could explain what had amused him. I don't think any animal has done it, he said. In fact, the explanation is very simple. Suppose you had been working all your life in this room, dealing with endless papers year after year, and suddenly you are told you will never see it again, that your work is finished, and that you can leave it forever. More than that, no one will ever come after you. Everything is finished. How would you make your exit, Synodry? The other thought for a moment. Well, I suppose I'd just tidy things up and leave. That's what seems to have happened in all the other rooms. Alarcane laughed again. I'm quite sure you would. But some individuals have a different psychology. I think I should have liked the creature that used this room. He did not explain himself further, and his two colleagues puzzled over his words for quite a while before they gave it up. It came as something of a shock when Torquely gave the order to return. They had gathered a great deal of information, but had found no clue that might lead them to the missing inhabitants of this world. That problem was as baffling as ever, and it seemed that it would never be solved. There were only 40 minutes left before the S-9000 would be departing. They were halfway back to the tender when they saw the semicircular passage leading down into the depths of the building. Its architectural style was quite different from that used elsewhere, and the gently sloping floor was an irresistible attraction to creatures whose many legs had grown weary of the marble staircases which only bipeds could have built in such profusion. Synodry had been the worst sufferer, for he normally employed 12 legs and could use 20 when he was in a hurry, though no one had ever seen him perform that feat. The party stopped dead and looked down the passageway with a single thought. A tunnel leading down to the depths of earth. At its end they might yet find the people of this world and rescue some of them from their fate, for there was still time to call the mothership if the need arose. Synodry signaled to his commander, and Torquely brought the little machine immediately overhead. There might not be time for the party to retrace its footsteps through the maze of passages, so meticulously recorded in the Paladorian mind that there was no possibility of going astray. If speed was necessary, Torquely could blast his way through the dozen floors above their head. In any case, it should not take long to find what lay at the end of the passage. It took only 30 seconds. The tunnel ended quite abruptly in a very curious cylindrical room with magnificently padded seats along the walls. There was no way out save that by which they had come, and it was several seconds before the purpose of the chamber dawned on Alarcane's mind. It was a pity, he thought, that they would never have time to use this. The thought was suddenly interrupted by a cry from Synodry. Alarcane wheeled around and saw that the entrance had closed silently behind them. Even in that moment of panic, Alarcane found himself thinking with some admiration. Whoever they were, they knew how to build automatic machinery. The Paladorian was the first to speak. It waved one of its tentacles toward the seats. We think it would be best to be seated, it said. The multiplex mind of Palador had already analyzed the situation and knew what was coming. They did not have long to wait before a low-pitched hum came from a grill overhead, and for the very last time in history, a human, even if lice, a human, even if lifeless, voice was heard on Earth. The words were meaningless, though the trapped explorers could guess their message clearly enough. Choose your stations, please, and be seated. Simultaneously, a wall panel at the end of the compartment glowed with light. On it was a simple map, consisting of a series of a dozen circles connected by a line. Each of the circles had writing alongside it, and beside the writing were two buttons of different colors. Alarcon looked questioningly at his leader. "Don't touch them," said Synodry. "If we leave the controls alone, the doors may open again." He was wrong. The engineers who had designed the automatic subway had assumed that anyone who entered it would naturally wish to go somewhere. If they selected no intermediate station, their destination could only be the end of the line. There was another pause while the relays and thyrotrons waited for their orders. In those 30 seconds, if they had known what to do, the party could have opened the doors and left the subway. But they did not know, and the machines geared to a human psychology acted for them. The surge of acceleration was not very great. The lavish upholstery was a luxury, not a necessity. Only an almost imperceptible vibration told of the speed at which they were traveling through the bowels of the earth, on a journey the duration of which they could not even guess. And in 30 minutes, the S9000 would be leaving the solar system. There was a long silence in the speeding machine. Synodry and Alarcane were thinking rapidly. So was the Palladorian, though in a different fashion. The conception of personal death was meaningless to it, for the destruction of a single unit meant no more to the group mind than the loss of a nail paring to a man. But it could, though with great difficulty, appreciate the plight of individual intelligences such as Alarcane and Synodry, and it was anxious to help them if it could. Alarcane had managed to contact Torquely with his personal transmitter, though the signal was very weak and seemed to be fading quickly. Rapidly, he explained the situation, and almost at once the signals became clearer. Torquely was following the path of the machine, flying above the ground under which they were speeding to their unknown destination. That was the first indication they had of the fact that they were traveling at nearly 1,000 miles an hour, and very soon after that, Torquely was able to give the still more disturbing news that they were rapidly approaching the sea. While they were beneath the land, there was hope, though a slender one, that they might stop the machine and escape. But under the ocean, not all the brains and the machinery in the great mothership could save them. No one could have devised a more perfect trap. Synodry had been examining the wall map with great attention. Its meaning was obvious, and along the line connecting the circles, a tiny spot of light was crawling. It was already halfway to the first of the stations marked. "I'm going to press one of these buttons," said Synodry at last. "It won't do any harm, and we may learn something." "I agree. Which will you try first?" "There are only two kinds, and it won't matter if we press the wrong one first. If we try the wrong one first, I suppose one is to start the machine, and the other is to stop it." Alarcane was not very hopeful. "It started without any button pressing," he said. "I think it's completely automatic, and we can't control it from here at all." Synodry could not agree. "Those buttons are clearly associated with the stations, and there's no point in having them unless you can use them to stop yourself. The only question is, which is the right one?" His analysis was perfectly correct. The machine could be stopped at any intermediate station. They had only been on their way 10 minutes, and if they could leave now, no harm would have been done. It was just bad luck that Synodry's first choice was the wrong button. The little light on the map crawled slowly through the illuminated circle without checking its speed, and at the same time Torquely called from the ship overhead. "You have just passed underneath the city and are heading out to the sea. There cannot be another stop for nearly 1,000 miles." Alvaron had given up all hope of finding life on this world. The S-9000 had roamed over half the planet, never staying long in one place, descending ever and again in an effort to attract attention. There had been no response. Earth seemed utterly dead. If any of its inhabitants were still alive, thought Alvaron, they must have hidden themselves in its depths where no help could reach them, though their doom would none sorry, though their doom would be none the less certain. Rugon brought news of the disaster. The great ship ceased its fruitless searching and fled back through the storm to the ocean, above which Torquely's little tender was still following the track of the buried machine. The scene was truly terrifying. Not since the days when Earth was born had there been such seas as this. Mountains of water were racing before the storm, which had now reached velocities of many hundred miles an hour. Even at this distance from the mainland, the air was full of flying debris, trees, fragments of houses, sheets of metal, anything that had not been anchored to the ground. No airborne machine could have lived for a moment in such a gale, and ever and again the roar of the wind was drowned as the vast water mountains met head on with a crash that seemed to shake the sky. All right, we're going to close it out there for the night. I've got really bad sinus issues, and it's getting late. Looks like we will finish this tomorrow after I finished moving. Until then, gentle listeners, have a pleasant evening.